Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. I'm so excited to have Tom Nichols back in the back room. We'll get to Tom in just a second, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So let me tell you a little bit about Tom Nichols. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's also an expert on international security issues who taught national security affairs for 25 years at the U.S. Naval War College, as well as at the Harvard Extension School, Dartmouth College, and Georgetown University. He is the author of several books on Russia, the Cold War, and international politics. His most recent book is Our Own Worst Enemy: The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy, which is going into its second edition as we speak. Tom, welcome back into the back room.
Thank you, Andy. Good to be back.
So I want to start off with your book. You got a new edition coming out. The original was 2018, The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge, and Why It Matters, which is basically about the assault on expertise and how that's intensified. Tell us a little bit about the book and in particular the revised edition of it.
Well, the idea for the book actually came from a blog post. I once had a blog, and I decided that blogs might be part of the problem in America, so I got rid of mine. But, excuse me, 11 years ago, I wrote this blog post that was triggered by a young person on Twitter trying to explain Russia to me. And, you know, folks that don't know me might not know, but in my earlier career, I was a Russia expert. I spoke Russian. I went to Russia dozens of times, you know, all that stuff. And that was finally the last straw. And I said, why do people think that they can lecture experts in their own field? Like, why do people walk into their doctor and say, Doc, let me explain this drug to you, you know, or even treats folks. I mean, it's everywhere. You know, when I was having my house redone after a fire, the electrician asked me what I was wearing. I told him, you know, and this electrician said, oh yeah, people do this to me all day. You know, they come downstairs. What are you putting in there? You know, and like most people, you can say, well, I'm putting in number 2 thin spaghetti. What would it matter to you? You don't know. So I wrote that blog post and it went viral, and then it got picked up by a right-wing magazine, interestingly enough. And then Oxford reached out and said, you know, you should write a book about this. And I didn't really think people wanted to listen to me complaining about expertise for 250 pages, but turns out they did. And the book came out in 2017, and then again in paperback a year later. And we always knew, I think the editors and I always knew we were going to do an update because there's just so much stupidity in the world. You know, we were already like keeping little files of, oh, if only this could have gone into the book. I remember there was one story that we held on to, you know, after the book had already come out, and it was about a fad diet. It's in the book now. A fad diet of like cabbage slurry that produces, and I quote, waterfalls of diarrhea. You know,
which everybody aspires to, by the way.
Yeah, you know, I mean, how can that be bad for you? And so we just had all these stories kind of built up, and we said, you know, at some point we should do a second edition and expand it. And then COVID came, and we decided we really had to do it. We really had to talk about, because I wrote another book in the interim. I wrote what was kind of a follow-on to some of the themes about narcissism and civic virtue and, you know, kind of poor behavior in democracies. But after COVID, I talked with my editor at Oxford, and we were like, yeah, this really we need to explain why this pandemic, against my predictions, made things worse rather than better. Because in the book, I said, you know, a major crisis, a war, depression, a pandemic, usually those bring people back to their senses about, you know, it's kind of like the people who say, well, I trust my own research about medical stuff.
Right.
They don't trust their own research at 3 a.m. when they're having chest pains. They go to the hospital and they do what they're told, because suddenly it's not a game anymore, you know? But it didn't happen that way. And I said, you know, we really have to look at why. And we have to look at it. We have to have a chapter about how did the experts screw up as well in all this and make this situation worse. And so there's a new chapter about COVID. There's a lot of new stuff. There's some funny new anecdotes. And there are some more. There's and in addition to the cast of characters. I mean, you can't write a book in this day and age about the death of expertise and not mention Elon Musk and RFK Jr. And that whole cast of characters that now think that they know how to do everything from build trucks to conduct a war in Europe.
Is that all just because of social media? Because the experts are pushing out all their bullshit all over Twitter and Facebook, TikTok, night and day?
Some of it is social media, but what social media the biggest part of the problem for social media is that all of the safety mechanisms and circuit breakers that would prevent people from just publishing something stupid and irresponsible are gone. I mean, if you have a Substack, you can write anything you want. If you have a website, that's part of why I got rid of my blog years ago. I wasn't comfortable putting stuff up there that wasn't I mean, I was my own editor and fact checker, and nobody should be that. Mm-hmm. I swore after that. I mean, I never had any disasters or anything. I mean, I never put up anything that was wrong, but it occurred to me later that, I just never wanted to work without editors again. The underlying problem is narcissism. The underlying problem is not that social media exists. The underlying problem is that people think that they are omnicompetent, or Richard Hofstadter used back in the 60s. That, you say to people, I wonder how they made that window. And there's always a Cliff Clavin from Cheers, right? There's always one guy saying, well, you see, Nami, glass is made out of shrimp shells, and they go on about this. And it's gotten worse and worse and worse for a lot of reasons that I detail in the book. But education is part of the problem, right? We, teachers are now therapists. College is now a client experience. The media has completely kind of fallen down on the job because there are too many issues and not enough reporters with enough time to really cover them. And of course, social media, where, every man is the king of his own castle with a website.
How much do you think toxic tribal partisanship plays into it?
Well, I hate to use this business school buzzword, but it's a synergy. It's in better layman's terms, it's like putting a microphone in front of a speaker and just letting the feedback get to ear splitting levels, because the tribal politicization of life in America means that we assign all actors around us into a category. You're in the media, you're on the left, therefore you're untrustworthy. You're in this kind of media, you're over at Fox or OAN or whatever. You're in that tribe, so you are trustworthy. People have lost any ability to decide how to trust information. And there are ways you can do this that are not esoteric. Students would come up to me when I was teaching, and they'd say, "Well, how do I know what a good source is?" I said, "Well, does it have editors? Does it have a corrections column? Is it a reputable press that has published many other books? Is it a journal that has a masthead with people who answer for what happens in the pages of this journal?" But nobody's interested in that anymore, again, because that takes the narcissistic fun out of being involved in the great issues of the day. And I think that's where the synergy comes in, because political leaders say, this is the populist problem, right? You, the common man, you're the smart ones. Like Trump always gets out there. You're the elite. You're the people who really know. And of course, that's hogwash. And it's always been hogwash, which is why we have a republic where we elect people to exercise their judgment rather than simply just, do whatever we're yelling at them to do through megaphones. And it just feeds on it, because that's a really gratifying thing. If somebody like Trump walk in and say, no, you're the smart, you're the elite, you're the special people, instead of a more stoic approach to civic virtue that said, look, I'm a sensible person. I have a basic understanding of some of the issues around me, and now I'm going to vote for people that I expect will carry forward things that I care about. That's not what this is about anymore. We vote for the guy, and this, I don't want to both sides this too much, but this goes back 30, 40 years to who do I want to have a beer with?
Mm-hmm.
Who's like me? You know, and sorry, but I don't want the president to be like me. I want to be smarter and better than I am. I want him to be braver and more virtuous than I am, for God's sake.
There's an updated version of that now. Now it's like, who do I want to bang a porn star with?
Well, and it's also part of the coarsening of American life that, you know, we don't care about having arguments about what's true or what's false.
Mm-hmm.
We just care about what, you know, we do it for the lulz, you know, we do it to feel good about ourselves.
Right.
And to have a laugh, even if it's a really crude and stupid laugh.
Yeah. So let's talk about some foreign policy, geopolitical stuff. You mentioned before, and you are a Russia expert. So you must have been on the edge of your seat with that real nail biter of an election, huh?
Well, you know, we were waiting up till about 3:30, 4 o'clock to see if the, you know, Nizhny Novgorod, you know, we're waiting for those final results to come in before we could make a projection, you know.
Yeah.
It really shows you how much Putin is both afraid and paradoxically feels very comfortable to do some pretty terrible things. The fact that he killed Navalny before the election, and for the sake of legal propriety, let me say, the fact that he put Navalny in jail where somehow died. How about that? Before the election tells you how scared he was. But the fact that he felt comfortable enough to hand himself 87% of the vote tells you that he was feeling kind of bulky about this. I mean, nobody in Russia. Look, I said for years I was actually an early give the guy a chance Putin analyst. You know, back in 33 years ago, 34 years ago, and I said, guy's a bureaucrat. He's got a shady past, but he worked. You know, he's been working in the pro-democracy movement. You know, Yeltsin's cut a deal with him. Let's see how this goes. Because the first few years of Putin, he actually did a lot of things that were very sensible. And he said all the right things right up until about 2007. You know, nobody wants to reestablish the Soviet Union. We're part of the Atlantic community. You know, we want to work with no designs on our neighbors. That would be insane, and so on. But now he's got to the point where, you know, he is... He really thinks of himself as a combination of Peter the Great and Stalin at this point. You know, one interesting theory about this is that a lot of this happened. I mean, he was clearly going off the rails in 2008. And he decided to come back. And he blamed us, and he blamed Hillary Clinton specifically for the demonstrations to keep him out of power in 2008. But my colleague Ann Applebaum has this kind of interesting theory that a lot of this stuff about Ukraine may have just been percolating in his brain during the COVID lockdown, where he just wouldn't see anybody other than, you know, trusted comrades. And it's an interesting idea that, you know, that as she pointed out, that the war in Ukraine might have been one of the weirdest unintended consequences of the pandemic. But for whatever reason now, you know, a guy who gives himself 87% of the vote in a 21st century election, like I said, he could have, it's possible that up until the past few years, he could win illegally. He didn't have to rig it. He was popular. I don't think he was going to take anything like that chance today.
So how dangerous is it, what we're seeing come out of Trump and the Republican-led House? For example, we recently saw Trump basically say to Putin, hey, go ahead, march through Europe or whatever you want. I don't care. These countries aren't paying their NATO bill, so go for it. And then you see in the House this refusal to support Ukraine. How much of a danger do you see that to American national security of things Trump is saying and the actions of the House?
Well, first of all, just think of how weird it is that a guy who holds no current elective office is telling the House of Representatives what to do.
Right.
That's the first problem, is that, you know, with the right these days, every accusation is a confession, right? These are the guys who say, you know, Obama's really running the government. He's not. Obama is off giving speeches and doing what he does. The guy who's running the legislative branch of government is a guy who's no longer in office and a former president, and it's Donald Trump. This is really dangerous because the Ukrainians can, in fact, hold this line. We're coming up into another spring and summer. They've gotten through the winter, but they need ammunition. They need shells. The Russians are dumping thousands of artillery shells on the Ukrainians every day. This is like World War I level of barbarity and just, slaughter, where they're just trying to drown the Ukrainians in artillery shells. And the Ukrainians need to be able to shoot back. And for whatever reason, and I've written about this, I have a few pieces in the Atlantic about it. I think one reason is that, the House is they're not serious. I'm going to go all Logan Roy. They're not serious people. Donald Trump says, hey, I need you to do this. And they're like, great. I like being in Washington. This is fun. I like being on TV. I get to, if I do what Trump says, I get to stay here. Okay, whatever. Because they have you don't really think that Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene or any of these people they don't understand the issues they're dealing with. And they don't care. And neither does Trump. But there's also this kind of Putin caucus among the Republicans of people who say, tough guy, white, Christian, traditionalist. Of course, these are people who have no idea how Russia really works, what goes on over there, how decadent, Putin really is, how little he actually cares about religion unless it serves him. But they've gotten this into their head because they've decided that they live in a world of, again, these tribes, friends and enemies. They've just decided Putin is friend, Ukraine is enemy, and they don't really know why. I think Trump knows why, which is that he told Ukraine to do something to help him, and they didn't do it, and he got impeached. So he's got a grudge there. Everybody else, I think this is just a problem of not seriously understanding what's at stake here. And I think the average American doesn't understand it because Americans in general, and this is not new, Americans tend not to draw a connection between their quality of life and their standard of living and what happens overseas. They've never had to live in a world where the rules on everything from travel to economics to trade are set by anyone but the United States. So like everybody, they have a normalcy bias, right? They're like, how bad could it be? So what? So NATO dissolves. So the Chinese, take over in the Pacific. Who cares, right? I live in Missouri. What's that mean to me? Well, if it happens, you'll find out what it means.
Yeah, or even worse, when you see the clips of people at Trump rallies saying, yeah, maybe it's time for America to have a dictator. This is astounding talk. It's insane. It's insanity is what it is.
But what they really mean when they say that, Andy, is it's time for other Americans to live under our dictator. They don't mean America should have a dictator. They mean other Americans should have a dictator, and it should be our guy who, of course, would never harm us, which is always the last thing people who vote for dictatorship think before they cast their ballot. And, in a lot of revolutions around the world, it's the last thing people thought before they went to jail or off to a prison camp.
Yeah, well, it's because they don't think it ever is going to apply to them. I just don't understand people who, a lot of whom are the ones who are enlisting and serving in our armed forces, who have fought over the past several decades, their fathers, their grandfathers, to fight tyranny, to fight fascism, to fight dictatorship, to keep America free. These are the people today, a lot of them who are saying, it's okay, it's time for a dictator. I don't get it.
Because they don't think, first of all, they've decided the world, again, is friends and enemies. And so they convince themselves, by supporting Donald Trump, I am on the side of the Constitution. I'm on the side of freedom. I'm on the side of the guys, that stormed Normandy. I'm on the side of the guys that, who had to invade, at Iwo Jima. And they've just convinced themselves of this nonsense, even though years of Donald Trump's personal behavior, including with his own family, should have convinced them that Donald Trump would run over any of them with a steamroller if he felt it would help him one bit. Doesn't care. They shouldn't. Any Trump supporters who actually listen to this podcast, don't take it personally. He doesn't care about anybody. It's not you. It's not me. To Donald Trump, Andy, you and I and 100 people at his rallies are all the same to him. We are just raw material for what helps or hurts Donald Trump. You help him, you're okay. If you don't help him, you're bad. But I think we have to get at something with this Trump cult about loneliness, about how much people just want to belong to something. You see it at the rallies. They wear the shirts and the capes and the hats, and they buy the trinkets, and it's almost like a substitute for religion at this point, where they just feel like they're part of a big movement where they belong and where someone's listening to them.
Well, it is it's actually, I used to think it was a cult, but it actually to me is a religion. They have Orange Jesus. He is the anointed one, the chosen one. He's been playing that up in the last several months. And how do you break that?
You can't. I mean, this is, for years we've been having this argument about, well, how do we reach out to the Trump voters? How do we convince them? And early on, maybe because I don't live in Washington, people, I get this all the time, right? You're a Washington. I don't. I live in New England. Maybe traveling the country in the past 7 years, talking about these issues. You're not going to, they're cats that have climbed a tree. You're not going to get them out of that tree. You can outvote them, and you can hope that some sliver of them with each election. You saw it after 2016 and you saw it after 2020, that there are a small number of people who kind of suddenly come to their senses and say, this is a really bad guy. This is somebody who really wants to do terrible things. But I think the defense mechanisms built into most of these folks are so strong that he literally could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue. My colleague John Hendrickson has a really soul crushing piece out right now at the Atlantic, where he talks to people at Trump rallies about how they feel about Trump making fun of people with disabilities. And it's the same pattern every time. Well, he didn't really do it. Well, he kind of did that, and that's terrible. And I wouldn't want anybody to be like that. But I still have to vote for him because, he's just giving back as hard as he's gotten, and he's been picked on. And no matter what you say to these folks, they come back around to, it's not his fault, and I have to do this. Because otherwise, and I think it's not about issues or about things they particularly care about. I think they've come to realize that they're in a church, they're in a cult, and if they recognize what Trump has done, it will place them outside of that community. And they don't want to be outside. They want to feel part of that community, and they want to be able to, visit with their friends on Fox every night for 4 hours, and they want to, get the emails and the texts from Trump, and they want to buy all the Trump crap and the stupid, let's go Brandon shirts. You're not going to talk people out of it. I just don't think that's possible.
Yeah. So let's talk about Trump for a second. He's up to his eyeballs in legal trouble. Where do you think this ultimately leads? And do you ultimately think he's held accountable?
Let me wrap all those up together and say no. The only way he's going to be held accountable, at least for some of this, is that he's going to go broke. Because, interestingly enough, Trump can defy the laws of political gravity. But when you're dealing with real money, there's a lot of guys in the world that don't really care about your rallies and your fan base. And, I'm a former president. I'm very popular. Yeah, we're still not writing your bond.
Right.
Yeah, $500 million, not today. But in terms of accountability for the things that I think he has done against our democracy, and particularly as a former federal employee, his handling of classified material, where, I would have been frog marched out of the building. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the judicial system is not designed to deal with this. and it's certainly not going to happen before the election. And the only thing that's going to hold him accountable is millions of people going to the polls. And that this is where I get frustrated with liberals. As a former Republican, and your former nemesis who counted on Democrats to kind of always do the wrong thing and not show up at the polls. I'm finding it very frustrating now, because I think there's a lot of folks who are saying the courts must save us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, but this is a democracy. The courts are not going to save you. No judge is going to ride in, black robes flowing, with a St. George shield and drive the dragon from the village. It doesn't happen that way. And I think that's especially a problem when at least one of the judges, in Florida, is now issuing, rulings that I'm sort of fascinated to see if Jack Smith actually, kind of goes up against her on this, now that you've had these multiple, kind of offbeat rulings. But you also have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court that I think has just decided they're not going to save Trump, but they're not going to take him out either. They're just going to push everything down, kick the can down the road, because I think, if they had their druthers, Trump would be back. But, they acted very fast in a decision to keep him on the ballot, and now they're going to drag their feet about this completely insane theory of presidential immunity. And to me, I have never liked partisan slagging of the court. I spoke up against that many times, against people both on the right and left who do it. But at some point you look at these decisions and you say, okay, so the thing that was hard, 14th Amendment and the ballot issues, you were able to dispose of that practically overnight. People keep bringing up Bush v. Gore. That's not quite fair. In Bush v. Gore, the court was up against a deadline, a real deadline that was just going to disenfranchise Florida if they didn't make a decision. But in a case where the DC Circuit has given them every chance to simply say, fine, this is good reasoning. We're not taking up this completely nutball theory because no one should, or we will take this nutball theory up, in some other context. Instead, they took it and said, yeah, let's have some hearings. Well, I don't know, late April. Well, when the court wants to move, it can move. And it did in this case. So,
yeah, well, we saw they moved very quickly in the 14th Amendment case.
Right. That's a long-winded way of saying he's not going to be held accountable for it before the election.
Yeah. And so let's talk about the election. It is ridiculously close. I mean, when you look at Joe Biden, I understand the concerns about his age, his mental acuity, whether or not one believes there's an issue or a problem there or not. But when you also look at his accomplishments, he is probably one of the most productive, successful first-term presidents, at least in modern history. In fact, maybe all of history, and that's domestic.
Let me annoy the people listening and say, since Reagan.
Yeah, sure, of course.
I mean, this is a first term on a par with Reagan's first term.
You're talking about the American Rescue Plan, finally getting infrastructure done, gun reform, climate, chips, strengthening NATO, building an alliance to support Ukraine. How do you explain when one guy maybe his biggest crime is that he's old and walks slowly, and the other guy is a fucking sociopath who wants to destroy and burn down democracy? How is this election as close as it presents itself to be right now?
Because we're not serious people, Andy. We live on vibes. It's the same thing that says, how can you tell me the economy is good? Do you know how much it cost to fill my SUV with premium the other day? I mean, people are completely unself-aware of the things that they say. And I shouldn't say people. Millions of Americans, I think, are unself-aware of the fantastic level of irony involved in their political beliefs, in part because, and I'm going to come back to this problem of narcissism, because we think whatever we feel is real. Well, Trump looks younger and he's loud and brash, and so he'd be a better president than the old guy who mumbles. Well, that's because you don't really want to take time to think about, well, what are they actually saying? What have they actually done? Yeah, the old guy mumbles a bit. Have you listened to the other guy who slurs and babbles and fires off random sentence fragments and, but that we have just internalized this two-party structure that says, well, here's the two nominees. And it's and both of them have to be judged as if they are both completely normal people in a normal election. And I'm sorry to say that the media has fallen into this as well.
Mm-hmm.
A little dicey for me to say that since I now write, for a living. But, every time Trump says something, it's completely nuts. Somewhere in a major newspaper, there's a headline that says, Donald Trump lays out an alternative plan for presidential authority.
Right.
It's like, yeah, well, that's one way to put, I'll lock up all the vermin, I suppose you could call it that.
Yeah.
But I think in the end, this still rests with citizens who are acting. And this is the part that just, kind of makes me tear my hair out. They're acting as though nothing happened over the last 8 years. They're acting as though Joe Biden and Donald Trump are unknown politicians who have just walked out on stage. And now everybody's sitting back and they're kind of putting a hand on their chin and saying, all right, I have these two people. Tell me about yourselves. I'm undecided. I need some information.
Right.
For God's sake,
Right.
These two guys have been part of American public life for decades. Both of them have been president for a term.
Mm-hmm.
What is the one more piece of information
That's missing.
that somehow is going to make the, sink the deal for you, right?
Yeah.
Saying, I've been undecided ever since 2015, and I didn't know what to do. But now that I see that, it's inane. It's absolutely inane. But again, I think, and I'll go off my soapbox about the voters because this makes me so crazy. I think there's two things. One is people almost take pride in not focusing on politics. They go, I don't pay attention to this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you're not a good citizen because, you are a voter in an economic and military superpower. And if you think that you should have a voice in government, then you damn well better start paying attention to these.
Mm-hmm.
The other is that it's almost like being undecided is cool. Well, I'm not part of those tribes. I think for myself. I make my own decisions. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fine. But look, I like to, I was a member of a political party for 34 years, 33 years before I left. I didn't always vote for the party's nominees. I didn't agree with all the party's positions, but I was a member of the party because I agreed with it and it agreed with me more often than not. Mm-hmm. Now there are people, I think, who have just said, well, parties and candidates, it's almost like this self-ennobling concept, right? Of saying, well, I will make up my mind based on my own research and my own views. Well, this isn't a game. It's not all about you every day.
Mm-hmm. Well,
things are at stake.
The voter soapbox is an important one that you and everybody else should be on. I had an interesting conversation last night with my daughter, Sophie. She's 20. She was FaceTiming with her friend, Erin. And Erin, if you're out there, thanks for listening. Erin apparently listens to every one of my podcasts. So kudos to Erin. So we start talking about their friends and young people and what their perceptions are and why some may not be supporting Biden or might be angry at Biden. And then we got to your point about voting. I said, I'm just curious, what percentage of people under 30 do you guys think vote? And one said like 65%. The other said 75%. And I was like, try 30. Okay, the last election, like 30.
On a good day.
Yeah, 30% of you under 30 years old. That's who votes. Now, when you think about saving democracy, you think about mass shootings and school shootings. You think about, as a young woman, I just lost my right to choose. My reproductive rights are being threatened constantly in every direction. Climate change, education, loans, et cetera, et cetera. There should be 95% of people under 30 voting. And so I think to your point, it's interesting because why is that when their lives are so freaking impacted by every one of these decisions. My daughter is very, very political. Her friends are. And so they were saying, like, yeah, we get it. But when we talk to other kids, it's like you can't get through. And so how do we break through that point where you can say to someone, yes, we agree. What's happening here is bad, or what's happening here is not attractive, but the other guy's a fucking maniac, and he's going to burn democracy to the ground. And, I was watching Paul Begala on TV the other day, and he said we should update James Carville's old motto. It's no longer the economy stupid, it's the threat stupid, the threat of reproductive rights, the threat of this, the threat of that. How do we get that point across, not just to young voters, but all voters?
Aaron, if you're listening, I'm going to say stuff that's going to make you mad now. First of all, Andy, you're being kind. Youth vote hit about 50% in 2020. But typically, just take whatever the turnout is and subtract about 15%. And then you'll get the youth turnout. So in primaries, you get youth turnout that dwindles down to, like you say, 20, 25. I always like to point out to people when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected, and some of my younger friends said, see, the power of the youth, her primary, the turnout in the primary in her district was 11%. Now, I'm sorry, but, and then, of course, in the general, because it's like a plus million blue district, whoever the Democratic nominee is becomes, pretty much the winner. But Seattle, they had a primary a few years ago. Somebody sent me because I'm always going on about this, so people send me this stuff. The Seattle primary, 15% for, I think it was a mayoral primary. The problem is old people vote, and they vote big. Young people don't. So the part that's going to make everybody mad, why? Because we have a very high standard of living, because we've become a kind of decadent and lazy culture. We have young people who say, well, I have things that are just too, much more important to do. And really, how much could anything change?
Right.
How bad could it really be? We are not yet capable of grasping and internalizing how bad this could get. Even I was one of those Pollyannas that said, listen, Roe v. Wade's not going to get overturned. It'll get limited, it'll get roughed up and massaged, kind of the way they did with things like Casey and other decisions. All bets are off now. You've got people on the court that are really extremist. And I'm a 63-year-old guy. Roe v. Wade is not going to affect me. It's going to affect my daughter. It's going to affect my friends, my nieces, grandchildren. And I think they haven't gotten their arms around that yet. That it's kind of like the example I keep bringing up is during the Cold War. People were afraid of nuclear war, but they couldn't conceptualize it. And it wasn't until you got a movie like The Day After, right, where suddenly people go, is that what it would look like? Is that how it would be?
Interesting.
And that, I think, helped to kind of focus people on that problem. I think the other problem with people not being serious about this is Trump is such a clown that he capers around like an idiot, and you say, well, this guy, how dangerous could this guy be? The problem is you're not seeing all the people around him in the background who are very dangerous, who are making plans and who are competent and know what they're doing. And this time, my friend David Frum has this great line that he coined some years ago. This time, the velociraptors have figured out how to turn the doorknobs.
That's great. That is awesome. I love that.
and that is a qualitatively new danger. But I think with I want to say one thing about the young people who are like, starting to just going off on Biden about Gaza. It is amazing to me that young voters who know almost nothing about anything else suddenly become deeply invested in a problem in a part of the world that most of them are not familiar with, don't understand what's going on, and decide that this is going to be the make or break issue for them.
Why do you think that? That's a really interesting observation, and I agree with it. Why do you think it is?
I think some of it is the nature. I say this as somebody who taught college kids for 35 years. Some of it is the nature of campus culture, which is that you pick something, it becomes the thing you get fired up on, the thing you carry. The thing you carry posters about. and it becomes your all-consuming passion for a while, because that's the nature of being an adolescent. That's the nature of being a young person. And that's the nature of, an insular college campus. You're not going to get people to march about, you can about things like reproductive rights now that they've, gone off the deep end, but you're not going to get people to march about things like book burning, book banning, first, civil liberties. I think that a lot of very privileged American kids want to identify with a group they think of as the underdog. And in the Middle East drama, in the Middle East passion play, or morality play, the Israelis are always the powerful bad guys. Palestinians are always the weak good guys. And that's a very easy black and white thing that appeals to people when they're young. This is why young people love, black and white, moral, clear moral distinctions, because this is the time in their life when they're trying to learn how to make those distinctions. And they like morality plays with clear villains and clear heroes and good guys and bad guys. But I could only wish that they were nearly as invested in civil liberties issues in the United States, in knowing about the American economy, understanding all the other stuff going on in American foreign policy. But this is typical, I think, of young voters. And then, as you say, point to the other guy, like when Biden wasn't being green enough, right? And you say, well, okay, politics is compromise. You're not going to get everything you want. Is there any issue, including climate or Gaza or reproductive rights or anything, where you think you're going to do better if Joe Biden loses the election? And then they get, not just young voters, but a lot of voters go, well, I can't be bullied into picking somebody just because the other guy is terrible. Well, I'm not, I lay it out as a choice. Decide what you want.
Right. Well, it's a grown-up decision you got to make.
That's how grown-ups make decisions. And also you understand that sometimes, you're not going to get everything you want, that you're going to have to take, one of the reasons I was a conservative is that I always thought that incremental progress was better than dramatic progress. That's a conservative temperament, right? But it also, I think, is why conservatives gained more ground on a lot of things in the background over the years, because they were willing to take little incremental victories under the radar, while the Democrats were having big fights about things that weren't ever going to happen. But I think people need to understand that this is now, there's only one decision to be made in November. And it's not about Gaza or climate or anything else. It's about democracy.
Yeah.
And everything else will flow from that. All the other issues that you care about are going to flow from this one decision, which I would argue has only happened in the past two elections. Never had that situation. But I would have included 2016, but I'll give Trump voters the benefit of the doubt and say, we hadn't seen him in office. Could make the argument that it's just a clown show, that once he gets in, responsible adults, yada, yada, yada. Okay, forget that. But the last two elections have only been about one thing. And deciding to get your, hair on fire about Joe Biden because of Gaza, to me, is, I guess I'll finish this part by saying, this is exactly the behavior among Democrats that Republicans count on.
Yes. So true. And what you said about campus culture really resonates with me, because I'm really starting to believe that the situation with young people is really just a nature of the beast. That this is what young people are supposed to do, because they're not fully formed. They have no perspective, no historical context. I mean, you and I are the same age, basically. I'm 64. I grew up thinking, oh man, there's never going to be a black president in this country. And my daughter grew up thinking, wow, my first president is a black guy. Like, now try to make sense of that in terms of perspective, right? So when you think about 20-year-olds, there's a reason why, like when you say old people vote, I think there's a really good reason for that, because old people get to a certain point and they're like, holy shit, all that crap that I thought when I was 20, forget about it, okay? That was just me being naive and inexperienced. And now that I know shit and I've seen shit and I can compare shit, this is where I'm going to be thinking. And they just haven't gotten there yet. And I don't know if we can ever expect them to do anything different, because I don't think it's going to change.
No. And but that, I also don't want to lower the bar too much, because I can say, look, part of the way you become a more experienced and a more thoughtful voter is you go vote.
Yes.
And you pay attention to those things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I started once I started paying taxes in the, I'm from Massachusetts, but I'm an adopted Rhode Islander now for so many years, decades now, and once I started paying taxes here, I was like, hey, I should probably read this bond issue question. It's on the ballot, it's like, the town would like to float a bond for, $97 gajillion to rebuild the fountain in the park. Oh, yikes. Maybe I better, and I think some of it is the nature of the beast, but their future is at stake even more than ours right now. I mean, everything that matters to them is on the table. But you're right about it's never been different. And I was going to tell you earlier, we were talking about Gaza. When I was in college, my first year of college, the big thing was nuclear power. Mm-hmm. Not nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, right? So I went to Boston University, which was right near, New Hampshire, right? I mean, it's an hour and a half up to the seacoast. And all my friends went one night and to go protest the Seabrook nuclear reactor. And they all came back and they looked like shit. And I said, what happened? And one of them said with joy, she said, we got maced. And I'm like,
it's always a fun night when you get maced.
Well, but it was like, look at us, we got maced.
Tear gas is better.
Standing up to the man about nuclear power. Well, let me tell you, Seabrook is still there. Mm-hmm. And the state of Vermont, the green, crunchy state of Vermont buys its nuclear power from that reactor. Yeah. 40 years later, you talk about things you didn't think would happen about the first black president. I didn't think I'd see the first black president saying, we should have built more nuclear power plants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No,
I mean everybody's come to that conclusion, and yet in 1980, if you had said, as I did, being the young, curmudgeonly, old soul conservative kid that I was, like, nuclear power plants are pretty cool, actually. I lived downriver from one in Western Mass. Clean, abundant energy, and suddenly it's like you were too insane to talk to. And I'm sorry, but if I went to college with you and you're one of those kids, Barack Obama disagrees with you. Booyah, in your face, kids.
Well, we'll end on that note. Tom, it's always great talking with you. The rest of this year is going to be insane, so hopefully you'll come back sooner.
It's going to be nuts.
Come back sooner than later, and we'll catch up on this crazy election year.
I'd be glad to, Andy. Thank you for having me.
All righty, take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.